So much. So I'm Marcy Sutton. I am here to talk to you about accessibility testing in both Angular 1 and Angular 2 to see what's changed and what that experience is like as a developer. I work at DQ Systems, which is an accessibility-only company. Our mission is digital equality, which is a pretty simple goal, and it's really great working with people who are already on board with that. So my goal by the end of today, if you aren't already into accessibility, is to convince you that it's something that you can do, and it's something that benefits a lot of people out there. I just tweeted a link to my slides, so if you go to my Twitter at Marcy Sutton, you can get a copy of these so we aren't having to frantically try and take pictures of code. So why accessibility? I mean, it's important to me, but why should it be important to you? Roughly 15% of the population has some kind of a disability, and it's a pretty big group of people. There's all different kinds of people in the world. When you think about 15% of the population might have some issue with an application that you're writing, that's a pretty big segment of humans on this planet. So it's really neat that we can actually make the web better for them. So let's talk about how we can do that. Some people can't use a mouse, and this is a really common thing that often in Angular apps, people forget to support people who can't use a mouse. Some people can't view the screen, either on a desktop device or on a mobile device. Some people can't see low contrast text, so they might have trouble consuming content on your website or your application. Some people can't hear dialogue or music, so they might need the live transcription in the other room, or they might need transcripts or closed captions for video content. Some people can't understand complex language, so they might need more time, or they might need simpler language that you might have to convince your marketing team to simplify a bit. What this means for you is that you need to add keyboard support. You need to add screen reader support. You need to add high contrast text, or at least text that meets color contrast ratios so that people can actually see it. You need to add captions and transcripts if you have audio or video content, and then push for the plain language to help people with cognitive or learning disabilities to understand what's happening on the screen. So guess what? If you have an Angular application, you are well positioned to already add accessibility support into your app. So I'm going to tell you today some ways that you can test for it and really work it into your job as a developer. So accessibility in Angular apps. This talk is mostly about testing, so it's not an accessibility 101 talk, but I will tell you some of the basics that you need to know about accessibility in Angular and client-rendered applications in general. First up, write meaningful HTML. Pretty basic thing, but somehow we forget that. So write meaningful HTML because the semantics in your websites and applications matter for people who use screen readers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Enable the keyboard. So guess what? My #1 testing tool? Tabbing with the keyboard. You want to just do a quick check and make sure that you can reach and operate all of the controls in your application, because that means that someone who can't use a mouse will then be able to operate your application. We need to handle focus in Angular apps and client-rendered apps so that if things are happening on the screen, say you're changing out the view, or if you had a list of items and you delete one, you need to make sure you're handling the user's focus so that they don't get trapped in no man's land or they're in the wrong area of the screen when they need to be over here. We need to alert users, especially using screen readers. If their focus is in one part of the application and there are alerts happening elsewhere, we can use something like an ARIA Live region to notify them that things are happening on the screen. And I'll show you an example in a little bit. But the real thing we're here to talk about today is coverage with tests, because this is where it gets really powerful and really cool with accessibility, because you can actually add support for accessibility through coverage in your unit tests, integration tests, in your CI pipeline, so that if someone breaks an accessibility feature, you'll know it right away, and you can light up a red light over their desk maybe and say they broke the build for accessibility. So let's look at an example of a site. It's since been fixed, and I'm going to show you what it looks like now. But this video is from a couple of years ago. The virginamerica.com website had some issues with accessibility. So I'm going to play you a demo video of what it looked like when you couldn't use it with either a keyboard or a screen reader.
link, more. Internal link, Virgin America. Link, book, list 3 items. Link, check-in. Link, manage. Link, deals, list 6 items. Link, flying with us. Link, where we fly. Link, fees. Link, flight status. Link, flight alerts. Link, sign in. Link, sign up. Internal link, Seattle. Internal link, LAS Vegas NV, LAS, list 6 items. Internal link, Los Angeles CA, LAX. Internal link, San Diego CA, San.
So there were a number of things that happened there. If you could actually see the screen, you might have noticed that we skipped by entire controls. There's some radio buttons at the top for round trip, one-way, and multi-city, and we couldn't reach those with the keyboard. So if you're using a keyboard, apparently you couldn't book a one-way ticket. We also had some issues happen where after I chose book from Los Angeles, there was an alert at the top that wasn't announced, and it scrolled the screen further down to the next section, but then when I hit tab again, we were back in the last section. So we weren't handling the focus. The screen reader user was not alerted that something had actually happened on the screen. So there's a bunch of issues happening here, and a couple of years ago, this was a really big issue. I am really happy to report that they've since fixed a lot of these issues. In the United States, the Air Carrier Access Act passed, and so all airline websites and mobile apps have to be accessible, as they should be, because everybody needs to fly. I have blind colleagues who go to client meetings, and they need to be able to book airline tickets. So we'll demo the fixed site in a little bit to see how awesome it is now, because it was a slick website. If you could see the screen and use a mouse, it's actually really slick for most people now, which is really awesome. So some of these basics, make sure that we're covering these. We need meaningful HTML. So the issue with the radio buttons was that they were custom, they were made from divs. Divs are not reachable from the keyboard, and they aren't operable. So to fix that, if you just used a real radio button, a form input, then you can reach it by default, you can label it, and this is actually the most common accessibility issue, especially in Angular apps, is the non-labeled radio buttons. So that would be a good win. Also, just using the native button element, because it's focusable by default, you get a lot of free wins when you use these native HTML elements. And here's an example of how you can debug the actual accessibility information for these elements. There's a really great experiment in the Chrome browser now for accessibility. You can enable it. And what it does is when you go and inspect an element, just like you would inspect styles, you can go and inspect what type of element it is. So if it's a button, it exposes a button role. So when a screen reader user lands on it, it'll say button. And then the text inside of that button, no matter how you're delivering it, and there's a number of ways. And actually, this tool shows you that there's more than one way to label it. So if it was an icon button, we could use ARIA label. If it has an actual text content node, it'll expose that. So using these modern development tools, we can start to see this hidden layer of accessibility that was a bit hard and opaque to us before as developers. So to demo these other couple of basic accessibility things that we need to support, I'm going to go back to Virgin America, the live site, and show you how awesome it is now. I'm actually going to show it to you in Safari, because Safari works the best with VoiceOver, the screen reader on a Mac. And I can just power it up with Command F5 on my Mac, and if you have a Mac, I encourage you to play around with VoiceOver. Remember, it does work better in Safari than Chrome. But there's other screen readers too. On the Windows platform, there's JAWS and NVDA. There's VoiceOver on iOS, TalkBack on Android. And so I encourage you to test with screen readers and just see what it's like. And there's some really great guides for how to do that on the WebAIM website. That's Web Accessibility in Mind. So I'm going to turn on VoiceOver and start navigating.
VoiceOver on Safari. Book a flight. Plane tickets and airfares. Vertical line. Virgin America. Window. Internal. Link. Skip the navigation to the main content. You are currently on a link. Link. More. You are currently internal. Link. Skip the navigate. Heading level 2. 4 items. Where would you like to go? Searching.
That's a new
Round trip.
feature.
Flights. You are internal. Link. Guests. 1. Adult. Select your guests. Select your guests. 1 adult. Guest picker is expanded.
So I hit the
You
enter
are currently
key,
on a
it
link
expanded
inside
that
of HTML
widget.
content. To click the link, add adult. Link. Subtract adult. Link, add children. Link, subtract children. Link, add lap infants. Link, subtract lap infants. Link, add pets. Traveling with a pet with 7 items. Dialogue, heading level 2. Traveling with a pet? While we love all pets, we can only internal
We
link.
won't read the whole
See frequently
dialogue.
add link. Frequently asked link. Contract of internal link. I understand. Proceed. Search flights by round trip. Search flights by one way. Search flights by round trip. Search flights by one way. Search
Okay.
flights by multi-city. Radio button. 3 of where selected. You are currently on it. Continue with San Francisco as your origin city or select a different capital. E. You're flying from Seattle. Capital O.S. Los Cabos. Search
Go to
flights from Seattle to
Mexico.
Los Cabos for 2 guests. The beaches are complimentary. C2SJD. You are current search flights by round trip. Select voiceover off.
So I was able to actually navigate with it. I could add a pet, and there was a modal dialogue that opened, and it sent my focus into the dialogue, so that as a keyboard or a screen reader user, I'm now in the right place, and I even know there is a dialogue. So that's what we call focus management, and that is a big topic in client-rendered applications. It also, once I selected a city, that banner at the top was announced. So they're starting to fix some of these big issues that existed on the old site. I think they still have a little bit more work to do with focus management because I was kicked back up to the top of the site. So there's a little bit of rough edges. But in terms of where they were before to where it is now, like that's an amazing improvement. So really proud of them and happy about that. Quickly, I want to tell you about ARIA, because if you're a web developer and you're getting into this accessibility stuff, you should know what ARIA is. It stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And if you remember the Chrome Accessibility Inspector, how we were looking at a button element, well, that button has a role of button. We can also use ARIA to sort of bolt on that role. If we had a custom element, or if for some reason you can't use a button element, you can use the role attribute in HTML to expose that same role programmatically. ARIA states mean what state is it in. If you're creating a custom checkbox, which again, you should really try the native one first, but if for some reason you need to create a custom checkbox, you can expose its state with the aria-checked property, or the aria-check state of true or false, and then a screen reader will then pick up that is checked or not. A property is anything that isn't a role or a state, such as ARIA has pop-up. You could use that for a drop-down menu or something like that, or the aria-label property, which is handy for icon buttons. So this is just a building block of front-end development that you should know about. It's a bit more advanced than using basic HTML because it doesn't change behavior in the browser. It's only that accessibility layer. So you would need the JavaScript as well as these attributes. So that's why we say start with the native thing first. Where this might start to sound familiar is this Angular 1 module called ng-aria, which I worked on quite a bit. It was contributed by a member of the Angular community, and then I sort of added features to it, added support to it. And it did things like manage ARIA required, ARIA, what are some other ones? ARIA disabled, so that if you were using the ng disabled directive in Angular 1 or something similar, it would then output the ARIA for you. And this was really great for a while. I think it got people thinking about accessibility. And here's an example of what it does under the hood. So ng-aria will attach onto common directives like ng-model, and then it will output things like aria-checked. And so it did a bit of magic for you under the hood, and that was all great. But there were some issues with it. Because ARIA is this advanced concept, and it's for custom elements only when we really want you to start with the native thing because of what you get for free for the keyboard and screen readers, it actually ended up causing a bit more harm than it solved. So if you're going to use ng-aria, make sure you actually need it. You might not need it at all if you're using semantic HTML. And so having seen this actually get adopted and how it got used and abused, I'm not quite recommending that we use it anymore. I'd rather have you use native HTML first, see how far you can get with that, and you might not even need to include ng-aria at all. So instead, and this is what we're here to talk about, I want to encourage you to build accessibility into your workflow with automated testing, remembering that it's no substitute for user feedback. So the automated tests are something to prevent broken code from going out the door, but you still need to have real humans using your application to make sure that even if it's compliant or accessible, technically, that it's usable, because that's your last line of defense. So to talk about accessibility in Angular 1 versus Angular 2. Angular 1, it's more the directive-specific unit test that you would write. So your templates and your front-end code are divided up into directives, so that's how you would reason about it in unit tests. These unit tests would be good for things like text alternatives and labeling. So if we had an icon button component or something and we needed to test that it had a label exposed. Keyboard operability to make sure that things like drop-downs still work, actually with the keyboard and not just the mouse. And then watching ARIA attributes, so that if you had something that did use ARIA and maybe it changed with user input, you could write a unit test to make sure that it would do what you expected. So an example of a keyboard unit test in Angular 1 is something like a modal window or a menu that it would close with the escape key, so that if the user hit escape, it would close it and then send focus back to where it was supposed to be. This example is from the Angular Material 1 project. In their menu component, they set up the menu, they press a key, and they've got a couple of little helper methods and a helper object with the key codes in it, and you just pass it the escape key code, wait for it to close, and then you test that it did what you expected, that it actually closed the component. And so that's an example of a unit test covering something like keyboard support, because in your application, you want tests that cover your specific components. And you can get really far with unit tests. You also probably want some integration or end-to-end tests using things like Protractor. And this is good for things like color contrast, where you need an actual browser to check what colors are happening. You need styles to be applied to have it be a useful test. You need it to be in the browser so you can use browser methods to check what's happening with color contrast. You could write integration tests that check that widgets work together with the keyboard, so that maybe you interact with one widget and you need your focus to be sent somewhere else. You could write an integration test to make sure that things are working well together. And then things like document level rules, like checking if you have a lang attribute or an accurate title. Those things aren't really right for unit tests, so you might write integration tests for those instead. And you might want to get help from an API. There's a lot of boilerplate tests that you would find yourself writing over and over for things like color contrast and label computation, where if you got help from an accessibility API, you wouldn't have to write all that boilerplate. And you can use this library to help you get up and running fast. There are a number of different options for accessibility test APIs. The one I work on is called Axe, or Axe Core. And I like it because it's got a really solid rule set for accessibility, and so that every person who uses it doesn't have to write all of those rules, because they can get complicated as far as the algorithms go. But there's other options, like the Chrome Accessibility Developer Tools from Google. There's an older one called Quail. Actually, one of my colleagues who worked on Quail is working on Axe now, which is great. There's Tenon, which Tenon and the Chrome Accessibility Developer Tools I built into a plugin for Protractor. So if you've used that before, those are the tool rule sets that that tool uses. And then there's another API called Wave. But we're going to look at the Axe Core API, which I like because it runs locally, it's open source. There is an enterprise option if you work at a big company and you need support to get your organization up and running. But it's really good for both integration tests and unit tests. And the really nice thing is that the rules that Axe Core uses can be also used in our free browser extensions. So if you're just wanting a quick test on something, and this is often, besides my keyboard checks, this is often the first thing that I use to check the accessibility of a website, is the Axe Chrome extension. And it will just run on any web page, either locally or remote, give you a list of accessibility issues that you can then use it as a checklist to go and see, what do I need to fix? But these same rules are the ones that you can use in your unit tests and integration tests. So if you imagine your QA team and your automated test team or your front-end developers, if you're all using the same rules, then when you file bugs against them, you have some consistency. We're going to run some tests against a demo app that I created using the Angular Material 1 library. It's got some really cute Muppets on it, and when you change or click a link in the sidebar, it updates the view with a different Muppet. The template for this, just to show you that it's got an H1 in it, it's got an MD button, which actually compiles to a button element. It's got an image in it, and the image has an empty alt attribute because the button actually has some text in it. So when you focus on the button, it has both an image and some text, so it's enough for a keyboard and screen reader user. The end-to-end test for this uses Axe WebDriver.js, which is a bit of a helper for Axe. It will inject Axe into the browser that you open with Selenium WebDriver, so you can make sure that it will actually, you can programmatically script using your application, which is really powerful because that frees up a human from having to do that manually. But in this integration test, I can write one that pulls in the Axe builder. It injects Axe into the page, and you can run axebuilder.analyze, which is a singleton method that you hand it a callback function, pass in the results parameter, and then that will return to you a JSON object with a set of rules. Things will either pass or fail. And things that fail, you then can go and fix. And it's the same set of rules in the browser extension, which is really handy. So I'm going to skip the command line demo because we're sort of running low on time. But you can, let's see, there's an example of using Axe WebDriver.js. I have some on GitHub, and I'll tweet those out after this talk. So testing for accessibility in Angular 2. So things have changed a little bit. It was a bit easier to reason about how to test in Angular 1, but in Angular 2, things are different. So what changed? For accessibility testing specifically, the biggest differences in Angular 2 are that it's component-based instead of directive-based. So the directives in Angular 2 are things like ng-for or ng-if that are directives, but they don't have templates attached to them. Your view-based things are more component-based, and they're probably written in TypeScript and/or ES6. And I would say the biggest challenge with accessibility testing is TypeScript. It has been changing fast, and it's really fun to write TypeScript, but when you're using third-party libraries, it can get a bit challenging. Property bindings are also a big change. So instead of things like ng-click, we bind properties like click directly on the element, and that's really powerful. There's an article from Victor Savkin about 3 ways to test Angular 2 components, talking about things like isolated rendering, and shallow rendering, and the different parts of your application that you can test in these different contexts. And then he mentions integration tests. Not much about unit tests here, but it's worth comparing this way of thinking about tests with how that applies to accessibility testing. I have to tell you that the biggest sticking point for accessibility testing is that for most of the checks that we run, the DOM has to be rendered and it has to be attached. And so I have a table on the screen that sort of compares, like if you had some tests that you were going to run, whether it had to be rendered and attached. Keyboard mechanics, absolutely, needs to be rendered and attached because we need window methods and browser methods to be able to run those keyboard events. Labeling, you could probably get away with the shadow DOM. Just if it's an isolated component, you could just check that it's labeled correctly. ARIA attributes, it's arguable whether you would need it to be rendered and attached. You probably would need it to be rendered if you were having multiple components talk to each other. In the end-to-end testing land, you definitely need color contrast to be rendered and attached. So if you had, and the comparison here is if you had a linter in your IDE, there's a really limited set of tests that you could run in your text editor because it's not an actual browser environment. So things like styles aren't applied. We really need it to be in a browser environment to run the most tests we can. So for some Angular 2 tests, let's look at the Material 2 library, which is the Angular 2 version of Angular Material. And they are still in alpha, I believe, but there's a lot of really great examples of how to test things and how to set up an Angular project in there. The demo, or the example we'll look at is the Material 2 checkbox. And so they are doing a really great job of making sure accessibility is part of their definition of done. And so the Material2 checkbox has a label. It exposes whether it's checked or not, so that if someone with VoiceOver is operating it, it will actually update whether it's checked. So the test for the labeling portion in Material2, they have a unit test that uses Angular 2's test bed, which Julie Ralph was just giving a really great talk in the other track about how to test with Angular 2. And so there's a bit of overlap here. But what we can do is set up this element, and then when we query it, we can ensure that it has this aria-labeled by applied, because that's how they are labeling their component. So this test is specific to their implementation. And I encourage you to write unit tests that cover your application so that if someone breaks it, you know that it's well covered. Another example of a unit test in Material2 is watching ARIA attributes. So they have this MD checkbox, and it uses aria-checked. I think this might be an older version because they have moved to the native input now, which is great. It's easier to support for them. But the previous version of this had a test that would ensure that aria-checked would update as you're interacting with it. So something we still need to work on are the Angular 2 keyboard unit tests. It's a bit bleeding edge. It hurts. I haven't quite seen it working yet, especially in Material 2. So instead, they are pushing all of their keyboard support tests to Protractor because the support there is better. This is specifically in unit tests. And there's an issue open on GitHub for this in the Angular repository. We need some fake event objects to make this easy in unit tests. And so I encourage you, if this is something that you're hoping for, like I am, to get better support for mocking keyboard events in unit tests, go give a GitHub reaction, not a +1, on GitHub, because I'd like to see this happen. And I did just see an example of a keyboard event in Julie's talk, so I'm going to play with that some more and see if it's enough. But so far, I haven't gotten it to work in the Material2 library. So you do still have integration tests and end-to-end tests, which are basically the same thing, using Protractor. So instead of having unit tests, you can still ensure that your application is usable to someone with a keyboard, which the keyboard case covers a lot of the screen reader case, just to make sure that you can actually reach everything programmatically. So an example of a keyboard test in Protractor with Angular 2 is the Material2 menu. And they have a bunch of really cool helper methods in the Angular or Material2 project. They use page objects so they can reuse code and make it really easy to reason about and keep it dry. So you can pass it things like a key, like the inner key, and then expect that an element is focused. This menu, it has test coverage for pressing the enter key, the down arrow, to make sure that it's actually sending you through the different parts of this component. And so even though the unit test land isn't quite there yet, you can still get really far with Protractor tests in Angular 2. And I'll show you these helper methods. Like the press key is just a shortcut for using Selenium WebDriver and Protractor, their send keys method. And then they have a similar shortcut for expecting the focus on a certain element, which really what you're looking for is the active element. And document.activeElement is the way that we usually test whether something is focused. This is just the Protractor version of that. So mocking keyboard events, there is a bug that you should know about, and the Material2 team is they've found a way to work around this, but the Chrome driver right now has a bug where it's not quite doing what we need it to with key codes. But you can just create your own events and pass those through. And this issue and the Material2 project, there are examples of how to work around this. But something that would be really useful as well, so far we've looked at unit tests and integration tests, which are specific for your components. But if we want to pull in that API that we saw earlier, Axcore, I've been working on the definition file for TypeScript for this so that it makes it easy to pull this library in and then utilize the API so that we don't write all that boilerplate in our tests. So in integration tests, once you've got the definition file installed, and I'm still finalizing that it's on definitely typed, which is one repository for TypeScript, Still finalizing what it looks like in NPM so that it's just a seamless NPM install. Once I have that finalized, it will be as simple as importing it, declaring it as a global, because we want to be able to just call ax.whatever from our API anywhere in our tests. Once we've got that imported, we can run the ax.alicheck method, pass it a document reference or an element reference if we're looking at a specific document fragment. You can customize the options, and the Ax API has, on GitHub, if you look at Ax core, you can see all of the different options. So you can turn on and off rules, you can pass in your own rules, and so once you've got this environment set up, you can run all of the same methods that the Ax Chrome extension is doing in that version. So once we've got, we use promises to have an asynchronous response with the Ax API. Once we have that response with a promise, we can inspect this results object that it hands us. And it has either passes or violations, and we can look for violations to see what we need to fix. So if it has some violations, we can console those to the screen, and our engineers can actually go in and fix the things that it points out. So to recap, accessibility is similar with all web frameworks. Whether you're using Ember or React or Angular, these principles are important because if you're designing or developing something for humans, which that's pretty much what we're here for, we should make sure that a lot of humans can use our applications. So it's really important to think about no matter what kind of an experience you're creating. We can provide a component accessibility contract using unit tests, which is really handy to make sure that the other engineers on your team know how something should work for accessibility. So things like keyboard support, labeling, all of those things. You can use integration tests to redirect human resources, so somebody isn't manually going through and having to hit tab. It's really powerful to be able to programmatically fire open a component and make sure it does the thing. It makes me feel really happy to ship a project knowing it has good test coverage. You can use an API for accessibility muscle so that you're not writing boilerplate things. And some of the algorithms for the rules can get quite complex because there's so many edge cases, so many browsers and assistive technologies that it really helps to have an expert, and you can import expertise, which is pretty powerful. So I would recommend looking at using an API. But most importantly, by having a unit test and integration test coverage for accessibility, you can prevent broken experiences from going out the door. And I've seen it happen. How many of you seen a broken build go out the door and then you scramble to fix it? Yeah, that's why I'm doing this stuff now, is because I saw those go out the door and I just went, there has to be a better way. And this is the better way, is to have the coverage. And your bosses will probably love it if you aren't shipping broken experiences. So thanks, that's it for me. You can find my slides on Twitter and on GitHub as well. So have a great rest of the conference.
Thanks very much, Marcy. So now we